History will not give the Jewish people another chance. Tonight on Frontline, Benjamin Netanyahu is at war. He is at war. He's under siege.
The days when the Jewish people remained passive in the face of genocidal enemies, those days are over.
He is so convinced that he's right, equally so convinced that Obama is dead wrong.
It's not going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. And I think it's time to tell the Palestinians forthrightly, it's not going to happen.
From the battles that have shaped him to the explosive political rise that would define a nation, Palestinians were fed up. So everything unravels. The country's political system was superheated. He was able to translate the horror of suicide bombers into political power. This is an epic story of Israel, Palestine, and the life of Benjamin Netanyahu.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה, לא במבצע, לא בסבבים, במלחמה.
Israel says it's at war after Palestinian militants launched a major terror attack. At the center of this conflict is Israel's military occupation of one Palestinian territory, the West Bank, and its blockade of the other, the Gaza Strip. To understand what's happening, it helps to go back to World War I. When Britain took control of the region, the land at the time had an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. Jewish migration was followed by the Holocaust targeting Jews in World War II and a big increase in Jewish migration in 1947. The United Nations, with Australia being a key driver, agreed with what had been known as the British Mandate for Palestine, which would be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish side accepted, hence the State of Israel was formed, but the Arab side rejected it, sparking a one-year war as Britain withdrew. But as the years went on, Israel took more land than had been agreed by the UN. Palestinians call this the Nakba, or catastrophe, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled at the end of the war. Israel controlled all the land in blue except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan, and the Golden Heights controlled by Syria. In 1967, in what's known as the Six-Day War, Israel seized the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golden Heights. Israel then went on to occupy thousands of kilometers of Palestinian territory, which the UN says is illegal. Despite objections from the international community, Israeli civilians choose to live in the areas for political and religious reasons. Here's where a lot of conflicts happen as Palestinians are displaced. We are protesting and demonstrating against. 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, a small coastal territory home to 2.3 million people, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Israel controls the airspace and the sea, and it controls the crossings used to ship most of the goods. The crossing into Egypt is mainly used by people. Conditions for Gazans under the blockade are tough, with an unemployment rate of 50% as well as deteriorating health systems and infrastructure. The group Hamas was formed in the late 1980s as frustrations grew. Hamas's goal is dedicated to Israel's destruction, and it's been designated a terrorist group by many countries including Australia. Hamas, which has a militant wing and a political arm, won the democratic elections in 2006 but wouldn't renounce violence against Israel and was isolated by the international community. It seized control of Gaza a year later, and while Israel withdrew from Gaza, it continues to occupy the West Bank. Means the Israeli army is the ultimate authority in the West Bank. The 3 million Palestinians there and the 2.3 million in Gaza do not want an Israeli occupation or a blockade. Another point of contention is Jerusalem. It's home to holy sites from three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Clashes in the region often escalate around major religious holidays like the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur or Ramadan. This is a region that's faced tension for years, but these attacks shown things could escalate even further. On October 7, 2023, militants from the armed group Hamas launched a surprise, coordinated attack on Israel by land, sea, and air on Saturday morning. The attack is the largest and deadliest in years and prompted an Israeli declaration of war at around 6:30 a.m. The attack began with a barrage of rockets shortly after the first reports of rocket fire. Fighters entered Israel near the Kerem Shalom crossing, an important checkpoint between Israel and Gaza. Around the same time, fighters also raided and captured Israel's Erez border crossing station. Targeting checkpoints like these enabled to neutralization of clusters of Israeli forces and spread into nearby towns with less resistance. By 7:30 a.m. Israelis began seeing groups of Palestinian militants arriving in towns and cities, sneaking in the incursion and fanning out into 9 towns near the border with Gaza in the city of Palestinian. Militants clashed in the streets with Israeli police and military. By late morning, Palestinian militants began destroying sections of the border barriers. What started as a small penetration of the Israeli border became a wide-open corridor. Soon Palestinian militants began taking hostages in towns near the border with Gaza. By now, at least 1,200 Israelis were killed and many more injured, mainly civilians. Israeli jets launched retaliatory strikes in Gaza, killing and injuring similar numbers of Palestinians. Said their attacks were only the beginning of a long war. For Benjamin Netanyahu, this latest clash is but a chapter in a lifelong battle.
3 armed Arabs today hijacked a Belgian airliner flying from Vienna to Tel Aviv. In his early 20s, Netanyahu saw military action after 3 Palestinian militants hijacked a plane bound for Israel. The plane and its occupants would be blown up. The world watched to see how the Israelis would react. The basic news is that armed persons who claim to belong to a terroristic organization, which is called Black September, took over a Sabena plane. Lieutenant Netanyahu would be part of the special Israeli strike force. Mr. Netanyahu was in the elite Sayeret Matkal unit, similar to the Navy SEALs. It's the fabled unit of the Israeli army. Netanyahu and the others dressed in airport mechanics' white overalls. The decision was to act as a mechanical and technician who is coming to take care of the airplane, and then they penetrate very quickly into the airplane. Suddenly they burst through the doorways and escape hatches, guns blazing. Passengers leaped from the plane while the Israelis dueled with the hijackers. Netanyahu charged to the front of the plane, gunned down the male hijackers, captured the Arab women, and freed the passengers. This was an unbelievable success. 2 of the hostages died, terrorists dead, and some of the Sayeret Matkal team was injured, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who was injured in his hand because of his friend's bullet that was fired in the wrong direction.
But, minimal cost.
In the days after the raid, Netanyahu received praise from Israel's president. He had earned full-fledged Israeli status, an essential experience for a young man who spent his formative years in America. When he was 7, Benjamin, who was called Bibi, and his 2 brothers, Yoni and Ido, left Israel. He spent some of his best years in the United States, and Netanyahu truly admires America, the American culture, the American language, everything about America. He attended elementary school in New York and high school in suburban Philadelphia. He picked up flawless American English. He's so American. When you have a conversation with Netanyahu, when he really gets engaged in it, he switches from Hebrew to English.
If you let me, I'll answer your question, Mr. Ajani, please. Now, it's true that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are now undergoing a period of transition. There is no reason why, under either Jordanian citizenship or Israeli citizenship, these Arabs will not have the full human rights, the right to vote for their representatives.
As a history professor in America, Bibi's father Benzion drew a dark picture of the threats facing the Jewish people. He sees a world that is fundamentally hostile, a world that is afflicted by an eternal anti-Semitism, that the Nazi Holocaust was part of a long series of acts against Jews. It was a worldview passed on to Bibi and his brothers. The outlook that is coming from his father is that there will always be a hostile world that would not care for the security and welfare of the Jewish nation. And in 1967, Jordanian King Hussein signed a military pact with Egypt. Bibi watched as his father's dire warnings were transformed into reality. Arab armies had massed on Israel's borders. In Egypt alone, there were more than 250,000 soldiers. Thousands of tanks from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria surrounded the Israelis. Hundreds of of rocket launchers. The feeling here in Israel is that we'll look at a very close and clear danger of being exterminated. The head of the Palestine Liberation Army, Ahmed Shukri, calls for a jihad, a holy war. We shall slaughter you, we shall wipe you out. Kill the Jews. Wipe out Israel. At least for Netanyahu's father, this was, history repeating itself by low-flying Israeli jets who swooped in from the Mediterranean, avoiding radar. Following infantry, artillery, and tank corps combined to sweep across the Sinai Peninsula. The 1967 war lasted only 6 days. Israel saves its own life. The victory was so profound and so sudden that it had a destabilizing effect. It set in motion a lot of what we're dealing with today. The war has created new refugee camps. More than 1 million Arabs have been displaced, homeless, and helpless. They struggle to survive while the search for peace, lasting peace, goes on. By the end of the 67 war, Israel occupied the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai. Israel had more than tripled in size. The occupation of land inhabited by Palestinians would ignite decades of conflict, but for the Israelis, it was a historic victory. That's the story of the 6-day war. It shows you have to be alert, you have to have good intelligence, and if your country is threatened, you have to respond quickly. A senior in high school in America, Bibi had skipped his graduation to return to Israel for the war to dig trenches. He would witness a turning point in Israeli history. You could understand why it's so intoxicating, and if you're an 18-year-old who was raised in the household of Benjamin Netanyahu, who has a fatalistic understanding of the nature of the world, you assume the worst. You assume the worst thing is going to happen, and then this miraculous best thing happens, and it has to sort of set you on a course for the rest of your life.
Netanyahu political rise.
Benjamin Netanyahu began his Israeli political career in the United States. He was unknown in Israel in the 1980s. And in Ronald Reagan's America, Netanyahu was a rising star. At age 34, Netanyahu was appointed Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. In 1988, Netanyahu resigned. He returned to Israel to build his own right-wing political base. By the early 1990s, Netanyahu's hardline politics were out of fashion. The talk was no longer of war, but of peace. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, now agreed to a historic peace agreement.
Ladies and gentlemen, the time for peace has come.
Known as the Oslo Accord. The signing of the Oslo Accord, the first agreement ever signed between, and then the handshake, an image that would become iconic. And then the question is, can this handshake lead to the culture in the minds of Palestinians and Israelis that coexistence is possible, that peace is possible? Now in Israel, Netanyahu was building a coalition of the ultra-religious right and security-minded conservatives. They strongly opposed the Oslo Agreement. The people on the right in Israel were not happy about the Oslo process. With an election on the horizon, Netanyahu maneuvered the growing anger into a political force. As head of the conservative Likud party, Netanyahu himself became the face of the opposition to Oslo. The kind of incitement, the portrayal of Rabin, dressing Rabin in Nazi uniforms or putting a keffiyeh on him. Netanyahu found himself at the center of the anger. In most cases, he doesn't do anything about it. Netanyahu even in some ways benefits from this association with the rabble-rousers on the right. He knew how to channel that outrage, and that coincided with his rise to power. Throughout Israel, the anger boiled. Netanyahu's advisor asked him at the time, "Don't you worry about some of this?" And he goes, "No." He knew, in a sense, what was coming, and simply accepted it. Rabin responded with his own rally, with more than 100,000 supporters singing of peace. Then as Rabin was leaving Netzim coming down the ramp, the man, a right-wing Israeli Jew, Yigal Amir, approached. Three shots from behind. The Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, the architect of the Middle East peace process, has been assassinated. Outside the hospital, the crowd began to chant, "Bibi is a murderer. Bibi, Rabin's blood is on your hands." The rally in Kikar Zion in Jerusalem that showed him in the uniform of a Nazi. Bibi Netanyahu is there, but he didn't support it and didn't agree with it. But he was there and he didn't stop it. An attempt to pin on him the murder of the Prime Minister, a political propaganda trick that was taken by his political opponents, mostly from the left, in order to delegitimize Netanyahu in the Israeli open political debate. Bibi Netanyahu faced the political consequences of Rabin's death. The American ambassador says they spoke about it the day before the funeral. Netanyahu said to me, Look at this. He's a hero now. But if he had not been assassinated, I would have beaten him in the elections, and then he would have gone into history as a failed politician." Netanyahu was thinking, well, politically he was on the ropes before he was assassinated. But Rabin's successor, Shimon Peres, would have to win an election, and that meant facing Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi in the election is running against Oslo. The week after the assassination, Netanyahu was behind in the polls by 31 points. People who have spoken to him in those days have said that he thought that his career was over. Then, as election day neared, 10 kilograms of explosives reduced this commuter bus. It was the number 18 bus, right through the heart of Jerusalem. There were some Palestinian groups trying to make sure that sabotaging of the peace process. Rabin was assassinated. Let us stop the whole process. It is actually easy to forget Rabin's great, heroic act when terror in our streets and people dying. For Netanyahu, it was an opening. And so Netanyahu is naturally returned to center stage as the person who had warned about terrorism and slowly starts to recover. 6 days later, the number 18 bus again. Victims were hurled from the demolished bus, only body parts could be recovered. Over 9 days, 4 bombs, 59 dead, and hundreds injured. And Israelis lost faith in the process. One of the slogans that came from the grassroots was, "This peace is killing us. Peres, go home." They taunted him, chanting the name of Prime Minister Rabin's assassin, Yigal Amir. Netanyahu started to climb in the polls. He was able to speak to the masses and translate the horror of suicide bombers into political power. But by midnight on election day 1996, it looked like Netanyahu's surge had fallen short. The entire country went to sleep convinced that Peres had been elected and woke up with Benjamin Netanyahu as Prime Minister. He became the youngest Prime Minister in Israel's history. Before long, Netanyahu's political support began to erode. Nobody was happy with him. The left wasn't happy with him for what he was doing to undermine Oslo, and the right wasn't happy with him for what he was doing to keep Oslo. In 1999, leaders in Likud began turning on Netanyahu. Even his former mentor Moshe Arens turned his back on Bibi and campaigned against him. He was in this sort of impossible balancing act. At that point, the Prime Minister's conservative base folded, and some people on the conservative right worked with the Israeli left to bring down Prime Minister Netanyahu. While Netanyahu survived the challenges within his party, but he ultimately lost the 1999 national election. By election night, it was clear Netanyahu was headed to a decisive defeat to Ehud Barak. He stood up, he said, "I'm taking time off from politics." And people saying, "Okay, we're not going to see him again." In 2002, after Sharon became Prime Minister, he tapped Netanyahu to join his cabinet in a movement to bring Likud's hard right into his coalition. Over the next few years, Netanyahu remained in Sharon's cabinet and worked at rebuilding his political support again. Then in 2005, Netanyahu leapt at an opportunity. He resigned in protest over Prime Minister Sharon's decision to withdraw Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. The conclusion on the Israeli right certainly is this is what you get for weakness. This view spreads from the Israeli right more broadly in Israeli society, the view that there is no partner for peace. To his supporters, the continuing violence seemed to be evidence that Netanyahu should be returned to power. Netanyahu campaigned against Ariel Sharon and was so close to returning to power, but he was narrowly defeated in 2006 elections. He would have to wait another 3 years before he could try again. As he rebuilt his political coalition, by 2008, Netanyahu was on the rise, once again the head of Likud and preparing to run for prime minister. The political culture has shifted. In fact, he is one of the main political forces that's helped move the entire Israeli political spectrum to the right. But Likud narrowly lost the 2009 election, but when a number of smaller parties formed a majority coalition with Likud, Netanyahu was able to once again become prime minister, and just like that, Netanyahu was back in power after a decade on the sidelines. Israel's booming economy and relatively calm security situation boosted Netanyahu's popularity throughout his time in office between 2013 and 2015. But in 2016, that would change. Netanyahu and Likud's support started to crumble. That collapse began after a bombshell investigation was announced. An investigation into none other than Benjamin Netanyahu. This investigation led to 3 separate corruption cases against Netanyahu, and in February 2019, Israel's Attorney General announced his intention to indict Netanyahu on bribery and fraud charges. But despite all this adversity, Netanyahu still managed to win the 2019 election. To some, he's a beloved leader who has consistently put their safety and security first. But to others, he's a despised ruler who has shown a flagrant disregard for international, and potentially domestic, laws. But who is he really?